The Eastern Front on the Russia-Ukraine war continues to deteriorate for the Ukraine side. They continue to suffer loss after loss, and now the entire Eastern Front is in a growing risk of outright collapse. President Donald Trump has now taken the reins and is now the president of the United States, no longer president-elect. And all the world's eyes, certainly all in Europe and many parts of the United States, definitely Europe, Russia, and Ukraine are paying a great deal of attention to anything Trump says here, trying to figure out what he's going to do. But as we're going to see in this episode here, I'm going to give you an update on the tactical situation and what's going on at a number of the key points on the front line. We're going to see that Trump's options here are pretty limited. We've been warning about this for quite some time, and now it's starting to play out just that way. And as he enters office here and is going to now take the reins to try to make some decisions, he's going to have some tough choices to make and some difficult no-win kind of situations for him to enter into. We're going to see how he's going to navigate that. But we want to lay out to you today what he's actually going to be facing. First of all, let's look, because the Russians have been advancing all across the line. The Ukraine side has been losing territory in several key places right here. Let me start off with in the north, in the Ksk area, because there's some interesting developments here that it might not be as it might mean something different than they appear on paper. On this upper left-hand side here, you see there's been a small advance by the Russian side over here, but then on the in the lower area, see, these are actually Ukraine advances. What Ukraine has chosen to do is to send in even more reinforcements to hold on to this territory. So the amount of force that Russia has applied to it, whether it's the alleged North Koreans up here or just their normal forces in these areas around here, most of the activity is in the west here, in the north, and then in the east, down in this area down here. This is Suja. This is the one big town that's actually in the salient. And Ukraine has chosen to hold on to this at all costs, and they're sending lots of reinforcements, lots of vehicles, lots of ammunition, weapons, logistics, air defense. I mean, all kinds of stuff they're sending up into here to hold on to this. Russia has appeared content to just continue to the slow, methodical grind. There was some talk for a period of time that they were going to try and have this completely sealed off and had been retaken by the time Trump came back into office. But now then here, what is this? August, September, October, November, December, January, 5 months of this incursion now. And still the Russians they've taken about 60% of it, depending on how you want to count it, definitely more than half of it. But they haven't been able to close the gap. And here of late, the advances have slowed down. That's because the Ukraine side has chosen to continue to reinforce this with all of their theater reserves they have to hang on to this. The alleged reason, according to Ukrainian Telegram channels, is because they want to have this a point of leverage for Trump as he negotiates to end the war here. But here's the thing. This is not going to provide any leverage at all. Not any. And I mean that as sincerely. There's not even a little. I mean none, because nobody is going to give anything away for something that they will eventually take anyway. They've in the basically the 4 months since they've really been actively trying to cut this down. The first month or so, they just put up a blocking force to prevent it from going any further. But it's been about the last 4 months they've been taking. So they've taken somewhere around 50-60% of it in the past 4 months, and in 4 more months from now, that's likely it will be going down to zero, and then they don't have to give anything in response for it. So if that's the intent of the Ukraine side, to give leverage to Trump, they're going to be sadly mistaken, because I don't think he even wants it, much less needs it, because he's going to negotiate something on the war, not any particular part of it. So I think this is going to be yet another badly misplaced tactical operation for the Ukraine side that's going to eventually facilitate their loss and won't have been accomplishing anything to their advantage. Because just imagine how many troops. No one knows the real number. The Russians say that upwards of 50-60,000 Ukrainians have been killed since October the 6th, when they started this operation here, and thousands of military vehicles and other kinds of equipment. We'll know once this is all over and people can go back in there and literally physically count on the ground. We'll know. But whatever the number is, it's huge, and it is absolutely pointless. And here's the next point. These reinforcements have come at a real cost to the Ukraine side, because while they've been keeping this and slowing down the Russian advance here and even pushing back, looks like maybe a kilometer or two in these areas here, it has come with a cost. And first of all, let's before we get to that part of the cost, let's roll just a little bit down the way here to the Kharkiv area. Now, this is something I think happened in the spring of last year, that Russia was going to get a buffer zone to try to keep Belgorod and some other places from being shelled. And they seem to have accomplished that with a relatively small number of troops here. And then that's where they stopped. They never tried another big offensive. And they basically just became a new line of contact. And there was exchanges of artillery fire, small raids, etc. And it's just more of the same thing that's just causing people to die in limited numbers, but continue to routinely die in here. But it's also required Ukraine to keep forces located up here. So they've had to stay forces up, so they can't use them anywhere else. Well, in just the last week or so, just the last number of days especially, Russians have been making more movements in this part of the front here to take in some more offensive action, which they haven't done in a number of months. And what it looks like is that this may well be a pre-move, or an initial move rather, to make a new offensive in this whole salient of the northern part of the Eastern Front. And this area here is called the Kupiansk area. And I want to show you this a really good piece on Weeb Union today. I'll show you a couple of clips from some of the stuff he showed, because it's very instrumental. But this area here will feature in this first clip from Weeb Union.
With this, the Russian bridgehead is expanding along the Uska River line, where the objective of the Russians is to expand it as much as possible, to have multiple roads and pontoon bridges across the Uska River line to supply their forces, to launch further and stronger offensive operations across the Uska River line, to gain full control over towns such as Tovarishna and villages such as the Patne, to launch further offensive operations either in the northwestern direction, to connect with their forces across the border area in the Kharkiv region and the Belgorod region, and also to launch offensive operations towards Kupiansk in the western bank of the Uska River line, combined with results from the eastern river line. And we will see that the Russians can do a pincer maneuver across both river lines.
So you see that it's the evidence is showing that Russia may be trying to do that Kharkiv area in the north, and in the Kupiansk area in that part, they're basically protecting their flank in the lower left-hand side, but then they may be getting ready to go up and have a pincer movement that's going to create a north and a south axis to just seal off that whole area in the north. Ordinarily, that would be a big risk for an offensive unit, because then they would be at the possibility of being flanked and hitting the flank on from either side of that going forward. Maybe the Ukraine side will think about that, but the problem is that they have so few troops, and this has been the case for at least the last 6 months, all across the front line. Russia has learned, they started being a little bit more tolerant of risk in the summer, and then they saw that almost no time, at least not in any meaningful way, was the Ukraine side able to mobilize a mobile counterattack force that was able to hit a penetration by the Russian side in the flank and then cause it to retreat. So once Russians figure that they can continue on and they don't have to worry as much about their flank, just because the Ukraine side doesn't have mobile offensive power to use in its defense, which, by the way, a lot of people don't know this, but it's part of the military thing. Even when you're in the defense, you still have offensive capacity, because you have to do that. You have to launch small tactical raids or other operations to hit the enemy in the flank and then move back to more appropriate positions to continue to cause damage to them, to keep them from doing exactly what it looks like they're trying to do right here, which is take some kind of risk up in the northern part, potentially to take off a whole chunk of the front line, as opposed to these methodical, slow things where they're taking in 1 or 2 kilometers a day. Now that they may be trying to take a whole swath of the northern part of that front out. And the only reason that's a possibility is because the Ukraine side doesn't have enough manpower to do all these things. And then when they've diverted a lot of them into the Kursk area, that means they don't have them in the Kupiansk area or in the Kharkiv area, which may be why they're taking advantage of that. But as we point out here, that's not the worst of it. There are some of the areas here. We're going to go next to the, Chasiv Yar is another one of the areas where there's lots of trouble for the Ukraine side. And we've been talking about this for a while, but you see that Russia has now taken almost all of the city. This is still what they call the gray zone, and this had been in Ukraine territory just a couple of days ago. So right now, almost the only part of the territory that Ukraine still has is these outskirts of the village down here. And, we've been over the last 2 or 3 months, we've shown how Russia has methodically moved through every bit of this and now has almost taken all this part out here, just leaving a couple of places on the outskirts where the Ukraine side still has effective defenses. Now that's so it's nearly lost here. Going a little bit further down to Toretsk, and you have really something even worse. By all intents and purposes, Toretsk is now a Russian village. They have now taken the whole thing. This small little outskirts of here, just literally a handful of buildings, like 4 or 5 buildings, and then a couple of other barracks buildings here. That's basically all they have left. And so these really highlight, these last two, Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, illustrate something that the Ukraine side has continued to do, which in the when this war is done and everyone's writing all these analysis from it, will really stand out as a catastrophic decision by the Ukraine side to fight for every single building. Instead of when it was clear that they were going to lose Toretsk or Chasiv Yar and redeploying back to some of these other defensible lines here where there's the Russians to advance there will have to go through open fields and they'll suffer a lot more casualties. They stay in these and just fight for every single battle or every single building, and then they end up losing a lot more. And look, it's not hard to figure out. I mean, honestly, just look at this area here. If I'm fighting you in these buildings here and I have the cover of all these buildings, it's a lot easier for me to do that than I can get within literally meters of you to be able to hit you. I can come around some of the underbrush or hide in some of the trees, go down some of the roads, just little dips in the terrain, all kinds of things I can do to mask my movement, but I get really close to you. Whereas if it's this other area where if they had, if the Ukraine side had gone back to these fortifications here, that appears to be some high ground in the middle, and then they have these fortifications here. Now I'm in a dug-in position. You've got to come across all this open territory to get to me. So instead of me being able to fight you from literal meters away here, it's kilometers. And as long as I've got the high ground here and I've got overhead protection from bunkers and other kinds of things they may have dug here, now then I can cause a much higher casualty rate on you for approaching me to all this area here than staying in fighting in these little areas down here where there's almost no protection. And you see, that's exactly how this whole area is gone. You've probably watched this methodically refer to this map as it goes more and more red, because that's what happened in all of these neighborhoods. You see there, it's easy to go up to here where now then you've got across a backyard, basically. That's how hard it is and tough. And it's just a terrible way to fight. And it's just completely unsuccessful. And so it's, aside from the firepower on the Russian side, the Ukraine side is also suffering from bad battle management and bad doctrine and how they're choosing to fight. And now then we're seeing the next place that a lot of this problem is coming into effect here is in the Pokrovsk area. Now you see that there's a lot of red here. And these, as you may know from this map, changes to the map, especially when it goes from either a contested area from ownership of one side to another, it goes into a brighter shade of either red or yellow. Now, I don't know why those are in dark yellow, because they've already had, though. That's not new. But this is a new. So the Russians have taken this whole area here in just the last 24 hours. And I think that's like a couple of kilometers worth. And then this is all in the contested area here. But what you're seeing is that the Russians are moving ever forward methodically around Pokrovsk, and they're obviously within direct fire range here, and you have the mortars, you have the artillery systems that are able to range from quite a ways back. Obviously, you also have the air power, the glide bombs, all those things that we've been talking about for a long time. All of them that we have. Julian Röpke, the German journalist confirmed that even a lot of these good fortifications they have, the Ukraine side just doesn't have enough manpower to hold them all. The Russians have no shortage of manpower, no shortage of artillery, no shortage of any class of weapons that they need. And so even though they still are suffering casualties, and there's no doubt they are, they're not suffering as many as the Ukraine side is, just because they have more firepower and more men. And the Ukraine command doesn't give the authority for them to withdraw to more defensible positions, so they lose higher casualty rates than they would otherwise have. And is the fact that a lot of the troops that are being mobilized are just insufficiently trained. They're definitely not motivated. They recognize the truth that this war is over in terms of its conclusion. They know that they're going to lose. They know they're not going to win. They know Trump's coming in, who's going to try to get a negotiated settlement. So their motivation and morale to fight is extremely low. They just want to survive. And if anytime that's your motivation, you're not going to be focused on doing whatever it takes to kill the enemy. You're just trying to live until this thing comes to a negotiated settlement so that you're there at the other end of it. And that unfortunately results in even more casualties. This is the Pokrovsk area here. This is now getting very, very close to another oblast. So we've been the fighting has been going on in Zaporizhia, the Kherson, Luhansk, and the Donetsk region. Those are the regions that that Putin annexed in 2022 and is going to feature very much in any of the negotiations that come afterwards. But here's part of the problem, and we're going to see how this is all starting to tie together in just a second. Russia is now, I think, within 6 miles of another province, the Dnipro Oblast. And so it may soon be an additional part of Ukraine that's going to the Russian side. And I'm going to show you one more clip here from Weeb Union that's going to show you how all this part of the front is fitting into the larger war effort.
The Russian main focus right now is the Donetsk region to gain full control over the southern parts, from Pokrovsk and all the way down south towards Velika Novoselka along the border area, following which the Russians have multiple options. They can continue the siege of Pokrovsk to flank the main defensive line of the Ukrainians in the Donetsk region, which will likely continue to be their priority. At the same time, they can develop offensive operations into the Dnipro region, where the objective can be to flank the defensive lines of Zaporizhia. The Ukrainians are building defensive lines in the front line in between the border areas of the Donetsk region and the Dnipro region, while at the same time they're building a more circular defense over Zaporizhia to prevent a flanking maneuver of the Russians in the area. Therefore, the Russians would have a difficult time to take advantage of such an operation as long as they prioritize the Donetsk region.
And sorry about that, I got caught short there. One last thing on the map that I wanted to show you, which really illustrates what he was talking about there. The last is it shows you where the Russians may go next. And he talked about how it was anchored in Velika Novoselka. This is one we've also been talking about. Again, a lot of Russian advances. Now then, there are reports that fighting is actually inside the city proper. So on that whole arc that they're talking about there, from Velika Novoselka all the way through the Pokrovsk area and beyond, you see it is similar to how Russia's looks like they're making a move to potentially cut off that huge swath up in the northern part. They're also similar making moves in this flank and on the Pokrovsk area here, where they could, instead of continuing forward, they could turn and try another pincer movement. And you see all of these fortifications in here. They could try and bypass all of those and basically attack them from the front and the rear, and then put the Ukraine military in this area in the position. Either you just stay and fight to the death, or you surrender, or you withdraw back to your side. But they're trying to create the situation, the Russians are, that they don't have to actually fight through all of these fortifications, because if they can make a penetration up in this area, then they can turn this direction. You see, there just aren't as many fortifications. And as we've been talking also, the Ukraine side just doesn't have the manpower for them. And that is actually where we want to go next. So that's kind of the tactical update. That's what's actually happening. And you see every single time that I show you these maps, 100% of the times, it's Russia's continuing to move to the west. This is one of the rare times where there was at least one spot where I showed you that the Ukraine side eked back a little bit of the territory in the Kursk area, but that's it. There's none of the other areas it is. So Russia continues to move methodically forward. Here's the problem. It's not merely counting how many kilometers on a map or how much territory they've taken, but on the overall size of the force and on the health of the force itself. Russia is using a lot smarter tactics than they did earlier in this war, where instead of just going like they did in Bakhmut, just methodically, city block by city block, building by building, floor by floor in some cases, which had enormous casualties for the Russian side in there. Now then, they're trying to take it from the flanks first, cut off all the supplies, and then start choking it out. And then once the defenders are put in a fight or flee condition to where they don't have enough support, then they are moving back, they're surrendering, or then now there's fewer rather than fight. So the Russia's casualties are going down and their ability to fight is going up. They have a lot, the Russians do. They have millions, literally millions more men that they can bring into the fight. They're still just mobilizing. I'm sorry, they're recruiting, not mobilizing, somewhere around 1,000 people per day, every single day. So overall, it's 35,000 per month that the Russians, and that has continued on. And so even though they've had to increase the financial incentives or whatever, the Russians are still willing to do it. The young men are still willing to mobilize and to go fight, so they can offset all of their losses. And even it's a net gain because they are suffering fewer casualties per month than they are recruiting to come in. So the overall size of the force is getting bigger and bigger. Not so on the Ukraine side. And that is really the bigger problem, is that now, and we've been talking about this for a while, they're getting ready to mobilize 18-year-olds. I think 25 to 18-year-olds is what they're about to open it up to. You saw Mike Walls, the U.S. Now the National Security Advisor, Mike Walls, said just last Sunday, I think it was, or Sunday before last, that it's time, if the Ukraine side is serious about this, they have to go all in and they have to mobilize down to 18-year-olds while Trump comes in and tries to negotiate something. Well, Zelensky has been saying, no, we're not going to do that because it's a huge political issue. It's nobody wants to sacrifice their youngest people that they're going to need for the future. And certainly the young people themselves don't want to go. But now then, that's what they're being faced with. Well, so it looks like they're probably going to do that. Maybe they're going to do it. Lots of people in the Ukraine side say, well, it doesn't matter if we want to. This is what we have to do because we're running out of men. And that's not just a supposition. We actually have General Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, has confirmed that they don't have sufficient manpower. In this article here, this is Ukraine media. This is not Russian propaganda. It says in a separate interview with Ukrainian news outlet TSN on January 19th, yesterday, Syrskyi acknowledged that current mobilization efforts are not sufficient on their own to meet the needs of the armed forces. We have needs at the front. We must increase the number of personnel in our mechanized brigades. Unfortunately, mobilization does not cover demand from the front line. So he's telling you right there, it doesn't matter what we want to do. We don't have enough to offset loss. So that's what I'm trying to get through to you, that every day the Russian side is gaining territory, but the Russians have never been that focused on the territory as much as they were focused on the destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces. That is their primary objective because they don't want to have to claw through all of the territory every inch of the way. They don't want to have to go through all of those fortifications, etc. If they can destroy the cohesion of the Ukrainian armed forces, the defense will eventually just collapse. And that, by all estimates, appears to be the Russian objective, and by all accounts, appears to be succeeding on the battlefield. So you see the Ukraine side's admitting it, which is rare that they actually admit something that's a big problem for them. Now, it seems it's evident that that is the Russian objectives because you had the Russian Minister of Defense, Belousov, actually came out and said, this has been a couple of weeks back, but he says, listen, the Russians are looking for victory in 2025. And he was pretty open about what that was. So the Russian army has set ambitious plans for the year 2025, i.e. they're not talking about something quick. They're talking about another calendar year. Wants to capture the 4 regions of Ukraine. According to the defense minister, they have set the goal of capturing all of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions by the end of 2025. In 2025, he said, Moscow plans to win the war in Ukraine and achieve the goals announced by Putin in June. That's the June 15 lines we keep talking about. He's then there talking about the same thing and saying that his objective as the Minister of Defense is not to get a good negotiating position. His objective is to win the war. He's not the only one. You also had Patrushev, who's basically their national security advisor. He said that not only do they plan to win, he said it's actually possible that Ukraine as an organization will cease to exist. Now, how do you suppose that they were going to win the war in 2025 and believe that the Ukraine side may cease to exist? Because part of the Putin's declarations, both at the beginning of the war and also on June 14, was that they have the denazification, which he defined as getting rid of all the people who have the Nazi ideology, i.e. what he calls the Kiev regime of Zelensky. So his idea is to outright win the war. Now, that's important because now as we have Trump coming into office, he's in a position to where he's trying to say, hey, let's get the best negotiating position we have. Zelensky has changed his tune over the last several months. And he used to say, of course, no, we're going to win. We're going to drive Russia out, 1991 borders, all that fantasy stuff that he used to say up until just relatively recently. Even he says, no, it's going to be a negotiated settlement. Well, that's all well and good if you're on the Ukraine side and if you're on the Western side, because that's what you think you're trying to get done. You have Keir Starmer, you have Emmanuel Macron. They're talking about using British and French peacekeepers in a peacekeeping operation to monitor any kind of a ceasefire. I mean, they are still thinking that we're in a position to where we can talk about the outcomes here, where we can get what we want. We can have the terms something that we're okay with. And the Russians are telling you loud and clear that they're not. They're saying, listen, we're on a path to win. We're not talking about negotiations. If they can get a negotiated settlement that achieves their objectives, I'm sure they are, because Putin, on the assumption of power by President Trump, reiterated again today that yes, we're happy to talk to Trump. We're willing to do so. We've shown you Sergei Lavrov has said he was willing to do that. And so they're willing to talk, but you see that they have prepared and resourced a battle to the finish. They're saying you can negotiate all you want, but when it comes to thinking you have some leverage, they're saying here's the reality on the ground. So important here. Don't miss this. The reality on the ground is that the Ukraine side does not have any capacity to force Russia into any kind of concessions. They don't. All they can do is delay, and die, but they can't stop. The Russian side has shown conclusively that they have the will to win, they have a plan to win, and they're in the process of methodically achieving that outcome. And look, by saying at the end of 2025, that's 11 months from now, folks. That's not a short period of time. That tells you that they're patient and they're willing to sacrifice, because they have set they've considered that it's an existential fight for them and it's worth the sacrifice that they're willing to make. So now then you have President Trump here a couple of hours ago in his inaugural address implied, he didn't directly address the Ukraine war per se, but he did say this.
And I will sign an order to stop our warriors from being subjected to radical political theories and social experiments while on duty. It's going to end immediately. Our armed forces will be free to focus on their sole mission, defeating America's enemies. Like in 2017, we will again build the strongest military the world has ever seen. We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars that we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into.
Yeah, that last part there is really important. The wars we end. Well, other than maybe some combat deployments like these ridiculous things we have in Syria, for example, or Iraq or some other places of Africa, there's no wars that we're fighting anywhere, but we are supporting a couple. One in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas and several other people, and then this one, the Russia-Ukraine war. So it's a pretty short list of what he meant by that. But he says we want to get out of any wars and we don't want to start any new ones. Now, that's crucial. Both of those points are crucial when it comes to an idea of what Trump may do then here, because I know he's got a number of good folks on his staff, and some of them are very much locked into ground truth reality. And if they lay out what we see here, and of course, they've got access to a lot more classified stuff than I'll ever have. But what I can see through these open source thing is conclusive, is that there is no path to even holding on for the Ukraine side. And I think Trump does not want to get into a war with Russia, and he wants to end unnecessary wars because he wants to focus on building up a strong national defense for our national security. And he can't do that if he's continuing to shovel stuff out the road in a pointless war in the Ukraine that can't succeed, and all it's going to do is empty out more of our ammunition and weapons. I don't think he's going to be supportive of that kind of thing. And listen, the last part of his comment there is also intrusive, because he said he doesn't want to get into a war. There was a German general a couple of days ago that was warning that actually Russia is not merely just building up a force to be able to take Ukraine, but it's building up something that's even bigger than that. And this was in the media here a couple of days ago. It says the head of the German military task force on assistance for the Ukraine side, Major General Christian Freuding, has warned that Russia is building up its forces beyond the requirements of the current conflict. We see that Russian armed forces are not just able to compensate for their enormous personnel and material losses, but they're also building more power. He continued on to say that month by month, the Russian military was acquiring more tanks, more ammunition, more missiles, more drones. Production is growing. The supplies in the depots are growing. And that is so important to understand, because I just showed you graphically, admitted by the Kiev regime, that they don't have enough personnel to offset the losses. They definitely don't have enough ammunition and weapons. They've been on the deficient side of that almost from the outset. Certainly since the end of the first year, since the end of 2022, they've been on the deficient side by a substantial margin. Those have only been growing. And now here is a NATO German general saying, listen, when you start looking at all these facts, they're making a lot more stuff. They're gaining a lot more people than just to defeat Ukraine. But get it, understand, if they're building a force that someday could potentially take on NATO, they dang sure can eliminate and wipe out the Ukrainian armed forces in the near term. So if we think that that's what Russia's doing, then it's in our interest to do everything we can to get this war off the table and to start building relations to go forward. Russia has said that they're willing to talk about that here in the recent days, but some of their senior leaders are openly saying, we're not really sure we want to do that. I think it was Medvedev actually said, we're willing to talk about repairing relations after the war, but we're not guaranteeing that that's what we want to do, because we're not sure we want to, because they have had to, by force of all the sanctions and all these, everything that the West has done to try and help Ukraine, they've been forced to find new routes for energy, new routes for economic output and input and trade, etc. And so they may say, we'll just keep going with that because we don't need to, because that makes them reduces the kind of flexibility and leverage the West may have in the future over them if they just immediately repair and go back to what they were before. So it's not clear that that's what they would do, but it would certainly be in their interest to do so. It would be in Western Europeans' interest to do so, is to get this stupid war off the table and then to get back to having good relations. No matter what, folks, the war was going to be over one way or the other in a relative near term. And Russia's still going to be where it's at. Western Europe is still going to be where it's at. And you're going to have to get along. You're going to have to learn to live together, whether you want to or not. It's just required. It's just going to happen. And there's enough people that don't give a crap about fighting. They just want to get back to living. They want to have a secure area. They don't want to have to worry about bombs falling on them or the threat of an invasion here and there. And if the two sides can just say, hey, we can coexist. Let's just shoot for something that's attainable in the near term. Let's just coexist for a period of time. And then maybe in a generation or two, we can worry about getting back to possibly friendship, which is entirely possible in the medium and long term. As long as we start taking the first, the near term steps that can facilitate that possibility. That is within Trump's possibilities here. And I'm hoping that he made some of these comments that he did here as a signal that I recognize this is a losing deal. And if Trump has made his name as being a good businessman and a good negotiator, that also means that you recognize that sometimes you just have a losing situation here. Trump is not immune to the idea that says, hey, if this is a losing hand, fold the hand, get it off the table, end the losses, and start putting your efforts elsewhere. He's already laid out an ambitious agenda to what he wants to do to rebuild America's strength and economic and the military and several other kinds of ways. Domestic security. That's where his focus is. And I think that he can just say, hey, we're just going to fold this deal, get it off the table quickly so we can get to the other stuff. That would make a lot of sense. And even though there's certainly a lot of people, because, we've had 3 years of the elite establishment in the West with all this fiction that they're going to defeat Russia and all this kind of stuff. So they would be angst if he did all this stuff and they would blame him for the loss. You can't stop them. They're going to say that stuff anyway, even no matter how detached from reality it is. But the fact is, if he does that and then starts to move on to these other things and has some success here, nobody's going to remember this stuff here. As long as he avoids something like what Biden did with the disaster of leaving Afghanistan, then nobody's even going to remember it. And in fact, even as bad as Biden's botched stuff getting out of Afghanistan, you don't even hear much about that anymore. So if you do a good job of disengaging and shutting this thing down, then he's even less concerned than you may otherwise have been. So Trump has some possibilities here to do something that's beneficial to the Ukrainian people, because he can end the death and destruction. He can end the losses that he has there. And he can definitely do something to improve America's national security and to stop the bleeding of ammunition and weapons and money and all this other kind of stuff that we've been given towards no fruitful outcome for the country. Other than, defense contracting companies, they've benefited from this stuff, but Americans at large have definitely not. And the Ukrainian people have been catastrophically paying the bill for all of this ridiculous lack of acknowledging reality that the so-called elite in the West have demonstrated. We'll have to wait and see how that goes further. We'll leave it there for the time being, but we'll see what Trump does, and we'll certainly bring it to you because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is or where it's coming from. We got some great shows for you coming up this week. We have Matt Hoback. Hadn't had him on in a while. Doug McGregor, Ambassador Freeman, of course, Larry the Shirt Johnson, one of our all-time faves, and maybe even have a couple of other surprises up our sleeve for you. But whatever's happening, count on Daniel Davis Deep Dive to bring it to you. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.